Daniel walked slowly through the narrow streets of the colony city. The air was heavy with smoke from the machines, and neon lights flickered above him. His boots were worn out, and his coat had holes at the edges. He had been working all day in the mechanical district, fixing pipes and old engines, and all he wanted was a place to sit down and rest. At the end of a quiet alley, he noticed a small cafe with a soft golden light glowing from inside. The windows were fogged, and the sound of faint music drifted through the door. He hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open. A bell rang gently above him as he stepped in. The cafe was warm compared to the cold air outside. Wooden tables stood neatly in rows, and the smell of fresh bread and hot drinks filled the room. Behind the counter stood a woman. Her dark hair fell over her shoulders, and her eyes caught the light in a way that made Daniel pause. There was something calm and steady in her gaze, as if she understood the weariness of every person who walked through the door. She smiled softly and asked if he would like something warm to drink. Daniel nodded. He did not have much money, but her voice carried such kindness that he felt safe here. She poured a steaming drink into a glass and set it before him. The liquid glowed slightly in the light, and when he took the first sip, warmth spread through his chest. It was more than just a drink. It felt as if the tiredness in his bones had been lifted for a moment. Daniel sat quietly at the counter, watching her move with grace as she prepared food and drinks for others. Her name, he soon learned, was Alara. She spoke gently to each customer, listening to their troubles, offering a kind word when they needed it. People left the cafe lighter than when they came in, as though they carried less weight on their shoulders. Daniel returned to the cafe the next evening. His day had been hard, and the machines at the factory had broken down again. Yet as he walked through the doors, he felt peace wash over him. Alara was there, arranging cups and humming softly to herself. She looked up and greeted him with the same smile as before. Once again, she poured him a warm drink and slid it across the counter. They began to talk. At first, Daniel only answered in short words, too shy to say much. But Alara asked simple questions about his work and his life. And soon, he found himself speaking more freely than he had in years. She listened carefully, never interrupting, her eyes always steady on his. There was something about her presence that made him feel seen, as though he mattered. Night after night, Daniel came back. He sat at the same stool by the counter, and Alara always had a warm drink ready for him. Sometimes they spoke about the city, sometimes about the stars beyond the dome, and sometimes they sat in silence. Even in the silence, Daniel felt comfort. He wondered who she really was, because there was something unusual about her calmness. Something that seemed larger than the small cafe walls. One evening, when the cafe was nearly empty, Alara leaned closer. Her voice dropped to a whisper, and Daniel felt the words settle deeply inside him. She told him, for a warm beverage, she could take care of him behind the counter. The way she said it was not like a promise made lightly. It was as if she offered more than warmth and rest. It was as if she offered protection and understanding in a city that often gave neither. Daniel did not know what to say, but he knew he would return again. For the first time in years, he did not feel alone. The glow of the cafe lights, the comfort of the warm drink, and the quiet strength in Alara's voice filled a space in his heart that had long been empty. And as he left the cafe that night, he turned back once to see her standing there, her eyes shining softly, as if she carried secrets that could change everything. Daniel woke early the next day, but his thoughts were not on his work. Instead, his mind kept returning to the quiet cafe and to Alara. He remembered the way her voice softened when she spoke to him, the way her eyes seemed to hold stories he could not understand. The machines at the factory hissed and groaned, but he barely noticed. All he could think about was returning to that warm place at the end of the alley. When his shift ended, he hurried back through the crowded streets. The neon lights flickered above and vendors called out their prices, but Daniel paid no attention. His boots carried him straight to the golden glow behind the cafe windows. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and there she was, standing behind the counter, arranging cups with calm hands. She looked up and greeted him with the same steady smile, as if she had been waiting for him. He sat down at the counter, and before he could say a word, she placed a warm drink before him. The steam rose in little swirls, and the smell was rich and comforting. He wrapped his hands around the cup, letting the warmth sink into his skin. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt natural, as though words were not always needed. After a while, Daniel asked her why she had opened a cafe in such a hidden corner of the city. She paused, her hands resting on the counter, and her eyes grew distant. She told him that she had once lived in a palace of marble and fire, where people bowed when she entered a room. She spoke quietly, almost as if she did not want the walls to hear. She said she had walked away from that life because she wanted to know her people, to see how they lived, to share in their struggles. She wanted to understand what it meant to be more than a ruler. Daniel listened closely, his heart pounding. He had never spoken to anyone who carried such weight in their past. Yet here she was, standing behind a counter, serving drinks, listening to the troubles of workers like him. He wondered how a queen could give up so much, and why she would choose to hide in a simple cafe. He wanted to ask more, but he could see that her story carried pain, and so he held back. Alara looked at him then, her eyes shining. She told him that every person who came through her door mattered. Each one had a story. Each one carried burdens unseen. She said that sometimes a warm drink and a kind word could mean more than any crown. Her words were gentle, but Daniel felt the strength behind them, the kind of strength that came from sacrifice. That night, Daniel stayed longer than usual. The cafe grew quiet as the last customers left, leaving only the two of them inside. The firelight from the lamps flickered across the wooden walls, and the hum of the city faded into the distance. Ilara moved gracefully as she cleaned the counter, and Daniel found himself speaking about his own life. He told her about his long days at the factory, about his father who had passed away when he was young, about the dreams he once had but had put aside. She listened without judgment, her eyes never leaving his. For the first time in many years, Daniel felt as though someone truly understood him. He realized that Alara was not just a woman who served drinks. She was a guide, a listener, and perhaps something more. Her presence made the cafe feel like the heart of the city, a place where the noise of the world could not reach. When it was time to leave, Daniel hesitated at the door. He turned back and saw her standing behind the counter, her hands resting lightly on the wood, her gaze calm and steady. He knew then that he would return again and again, not only for the warmth of the drink, but for the quiet strength she gave him. Outside, the city roared with noise and chaos. But Daniel carried the memory of her words with him, like a flame that would not go out. The city outside the cafe was restless. Smoke hung heavy in the streets, and people whispered about shortages and unfair rules. Soldiers walked in groups, their boots striking the ground in harsh rhythm. At night, the sound of arguments echoed in the alleys. Something was breaking beneath the surface, and Daniel could feel it even when he tried to ignore it. Inside the cafe, things were different. The moment Daniel stepped through the door, the warmth surrounded him. Alara always welcomed him with a gentle smile and a warm drink, as if the troubles outside could not cross the threshold. But Daniel could not forget what he saw in the streets. He spoke to her about it one night, telling her how the people were unhappy and how the leaders of the city cared little for the workers. She listened quietly, her eyes calm, but he sensed that she already knew. One evening, when the cafe was nearly empty, Daniel noticed a group of men and women sitting at the far table. They spoke in low voices, leaning close to one another. Alara brought them drinks, and they nodded respectfully when she approached. Daniel wondered who they were, but he said nothing. Later, when the cafe was closing, he asked Alara. She told him they were friends, people who dreamed of a better city. She said they came to her cafe because it was safe to speak there. Daniel began to understand. The cafe was more than a place to rest. It was a meeting place for those who wanted change. Alara's presence gave them courage. Her quiet strength was like a shield against the fear that filled the streets. Daniel realized that she was not only a queen who had walked away from her throne, but also a leader who had never stopped caring for her people. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel found himself helping in small ways. He carried supplies, fixed broken chairs, and sometimes stayed late to clean. But more than that, he began to listen to the voices around him. He heard stories of unfair taxes, of families pushed from their homes, of workers beaten for speaking out. The anger in the city was rising, and Daniel felt it growing inside him too. One night, as the cafe lights burned low, Alara gathered a few trusted friends at the counter. Daniel was there, though he was unsure if he belonged. She spoke to them softly, but firmly. She said the city was in need of truth, that the people must be reminded of their worth. She said the rulers had forgotten that power was meant to serve, not to control. Her words were simple, yet they carried weight. Everyone listened, their eyes fixed on her, as though she were a light in the darkness. Daniel felt a stirring in his chest. He had never thought of himself as brave. He had lived quietly, repairing machines, keeping his head down. But as he listened to Alara, he wondered if he could do more. Perhaps he could stand beside her, not as a soldier, but as someone who believed in her vision. The unrest outside grew worse. Soldiers searched houses at night, and posters with warnings were nailed to the walls. People were told to remain silent, but whispers only spread faster. In the alleys and marketplaces, Daniel overheard talk of resistance. And always, the cafe was at the center, a place where hope was passed, like a cup of warm drink from one hand to another. One evening, Daniel walked into the cafe and found Clara, Joseph, and Matthew sitting at the counter. They were ordinary people like him, but their eyes carried determination. Clara worked in the kitchens of the city, Joseph repaired roofs, and Matthew was a teacher. Yet here they sat, planning quietly with Alara. Daniel realized then that courage did not belong only to soldiers, it belonged to anyone who chose to stand up. As he sat listening, Daniel felt a change within himself. The cafe was no longer just a refuge, it was the heart of something larger. He looked at Alara, who met his gaze with calm certainty, and he knew that his life was about to take a different path. Outside, the city shook with unrest, but inside the cafe, a quiet fire of resistance had begun to burn. The city reached a breaking point. Soldiers filled the streets, their weapons ready, their voices shouting orders. Posters were torn down as quickly as they were nailed up. People no longer hid their anger. They gathered in markets and squares, whispering about the day they would rise. Fear was everywhere, but so was the hope that change was near. Daniel felt the tension every time he walked to the cafe. The quiet place had become more than a shop. It was a center of hope, though few outside knew it. Inside, Alara still welcomed everyone with warmth, but Daniel could see the weight she carried. Her smile remained calm, yet her eyes told him she was preparing for what was to come. One night, soldiers marched close to the alley where the cafe stood. Their boots struck the stones like thunder. Daniel rushed inside and found Clara, Joseph, and Matthew already there. They were speaking in hurried voices, their faces tight with worry. Alara stood behind the counter, her hands resting firmly on the wood. She listened, then spoke with quiet strength. She said the time had come to step out of hiding.
Oh.
Daniel felt his chest tighten. He had never been part of anything so dangerous. But when Alara looked at him, her steady eyes filled with trust, he knew he could not turn away. He nodded and she gave him a faint smile, as though she already knew his answer. The next day, the soldiers stormed the main square. They shouted at the crowds to go home, but people stood their ground. News spread quickly, and by evening, the cafe was full of people seeking guidance. Alara stepped forward, no longer only the woman behind the counter. She spoke clearly, her voice carrying across the room. She told them she would no longer remain in silence. She declared herself queen once more, not with a crown, but with the strength of her words. She said the city belonged to its people, and together they could take it back. Daniel felt the room change. The air was filled with courage. People cheered softly, some with tears in their eyes. For years they had lived in fear, but now they had someone to follow. Clara stood tall beside Alara. Joseph clenched his fists with determination. Matthew promised to spread her message through every corner of the city. That night, soldiers came looking for her. They marched down the alley and pushed open the cafe doors. But Daniel and the others were ready. They blocked the entrance with tables and chairs. Holding whatever tools they could find, Daniel gripped a heavy pipe, his hands shaking, but he did not step back. Clara threw boiling water at the soldiers, Joseph swung a hammer, and Matthew shouted for the people outside to stand strong. The cafe became a battleground. Warm lights flickered as glass shattered and wood splintered. Daniel fought with all his strength, not as a trained soldier, but as a man who refused to give up. Each strike of his arm was filled with the memory of Ilara's words, the promise of a city where people could live without fear. Through the chaos, Alara stood at the counter, her voice calm but powerful. She called out to the people outside, telling them not to be afraid, telling them this was their moment. Her presence was like fire, steady and bright. The soldiers hesitated, shaken by the strength they faced. More and more people rushed to the cafe, surrounding it, shouting in defiance. The soldiers were forced to retreat, their boots pounding the stones as they fled the alley. When silence returned, the cafe was broken but still standing. Tables were overturned, windows cracked, and the smell of smoke hung in the air. Yet the people inside stood tall, their hearts stronger than before. Daniel's hands ached, but he felt no fear. He looked at Alara, and she met his gaze with pride. She had revealed herself fully, no longer hidden, no longer only a keeper of warm drinks. She was their queen, and her cafe had become the heart of the uprising. Daniel knew this was only the beginning. Fight for the city had started, and he would stand at her side, no matter how dangerous the path ahead might be. The city awoke to a new dawn. Word of the clash at the cafe spread quickly, and the people began to believe that change was truly possible. For years they had been silent, but now they spoke openly in the streets. Murals appeared on walls, showing the queen who had returned. The sound of hope carried from one district to another like a song that could not be silenced. Daniel walked the streets and felt the difference. People greeted each other with nods of courage. Neighbors who had once kept their doors closed now stood together in the open. Even the children sensed the shift, running through the alleys without fear. But Daniel also knew that the fight was not finished. The rulers of the city still had soldiers in power, and they would not let go easily. Inside the cafe, the heart of the movement beat stronger than ever. The broken windows were covered with boards, the counter bore scratches from the battle, but the warmth remained.
Ow.
Each night people filled the room, listening to Alara speak. She did not stand above them, but among them, her words simple yet filled with truth. She spoke of unity, of courage, and of a city where every voice mattered. Daniel stood close, watching the way her words lit up the faces around her. When soldiers returned to the streets, they found resistance at every corner. Workers refused to bow, families hid those who were hunted, and messengers carried secret notes through the alleys. Daniel joined Clara, Joseph, and Matthew in leading small groups. They guided people, fixed what was broken, and stood guard at night. Daniel no longer felt like a quiet mechanic. He was part of something greater, and though fear still touched him, it no longer ruled him. One evening, the rulers gathered their forces and marched toward the square. Torches lit the dark streets, and the sound of drums echoed. Daniel and his friends knew this would be the moment that decided everything. He walked beside Alara as they entered the square where thousands had already gathered. The people stood shoulder to shoulder, holding nothing but tools, lanterns, and the strength of their voices. The soldiers demanded that Alara surrender. They shouted that she had no right to lead, that she was only a woman who had abandoned her throne. She stepped forward calmly, her head held high. Her voice rang clear through the square, stronger than the sound of drums. She told the soldiers that she had never abandoned her people, that she had walked among them to share their lives, and that now she stood not above them, but with them. Her words carried across the square, and even some soldiers lowered their weapons, unsure of where they stood. Daniel watched in awe as her courage spread through the crowd. The people began to chant her name, their voices rising together. The rulers tried to push forward, but the wave of voices grew too strong. The soldiers faltered, and one by one, many laid down their weapons. The rulers were forced to retreat, their power broken not by blades but by the unity of the people. When the square fell silent again, Alara turned to the crowd. She promised that the city would no longer be ruled by fear. She promised that no voice would be forgotten. The people cheered, tears on their faces, and Daniel felt pride swell within him. He had lived his life in shadows, but now he stood in the light of a new beginning. In the days that followed, peace returned slowly. The city was scarred, but its spirit was strong. Alara was crowned once more, not in a palace far away, but in the heart of the city itself. She kept the cafe open, its doors wide, its counter polished, a place where anyone could come for comfort and truth. One evening, when the work of rebuilding was done for the day, Daniel sat once again at the counter. The cafe was quieter now, lit by the soft glow of lamps. Ilara stood behind the counter, her hands gentle as she placed a steaming cup before him. She leaned closer, her voice calm, and whispered the same words she had spoken the first night they met. For a warm beverage, she said, she could take care of him behind the counter. Daniel smiled, and in that moment, he knew the promise had been kept.